Hi everyone, it's Lindsay, and today I want to share with you how to do a watercolor wash on the backgrounds of your card. So I am starting off with a piece of watercolor paper, and this measures 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches, and I just have it loaded up into my MISTI. Now I will be using this brand new stamp set. It is called Be Brave, and it is a big set. This is from their Color by Faith series, and it has so many great images in it. The amount of projects and Bible journaling pages and cards you can create with this one stamp set is really kind of amazing. So I'm using this great feather image from the set, and this is the larger one. There's also a smaller feather too. Now I'm just going to put this right down on top of my watercolor paper, and I do have to push my paper up a little bit. I'm going to have another feather stamped over this that's going to hang off the edge a little bit, so I have pushed my cardstock away from the edges, so I use my bone folder to hold my paper in place. Now I am using waterproof black dye ink to stamp down this feather, and I'm just going to go ahead and ink that up and stamp that right down. Now on watercolor paper, and especially large images like this, I always like to do a double stamping just so I get a nice dark impression. You can see that it stamped really well the first time, but I did go back in with a second stamping. Now I went ahead and made a mask out of this feather just from Inkadinkado masking paper. I covered up that first stamp, went ahead and moved that same stamp over to where the little circles or beads that are on top of that feather line up and overlap on the stamp. So then I can just stamp this second feather right over the top, and it looks as if the two are connected. So it looks as if they're actually one, and just there's one bead on there. So I need to go ahead and mask these feathers so I can do a watercolor wash over this back panel here. I'll be using liquid frisket for this, and I go ahead and open up my bottle. Now you want to use an old paintbrush and give it a quick stir. You do not want to shake this. Once you shake it, you're going to have air bubbles in there. Those air bubbles could lead to your watercolor leaking underneath your mask. It's just going to be a mess. So don't shake it. Just use your old paintbrush to stir it up. Then I use a baby wipe to go ahead and clear off that brush, and then I'll just paint on that liquid frisket with the same exact brush. Now this stuff stinks. There's no great way to say it. It stinks. So you do want to work a little quickly here so you just don't have to smell that smell the entire time. But once I have that completely covered, I go ahead and set that aside to dry. Now, after a few times of using the same brush, it's going to get ruined, but I do like to clean it off and get as many uses out of it as I can. So just make sure you're using a cheap brush to put this on, not one of your more expensive watercolor brushes. So while I set that aside to dry, I'm going to go ahead and work on this background that I'm going to overlay my watercolor panel onto. I said there were a lot of great images in this stamp set, and I'm going to be using some of the arrows, the smaller arrows from that set. Now there are 4 arrows, and I'm going to be using all of them to create this background. I've cut a piece of blue cardstock, and I'm using the same color blue dye ink to stamp over top of this for a little bit of a tone-on-tone look. Now this cardstock measures 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches, so it's a 1/4 inch smaller than my card base, but a 1/4 inch larger than my feather panel. And I am just going to stamp these feathers repeatedly to make a nice pattern paper here. Now I'm alternating which ways the arrows are facing so it doesn't look so repetitive, and I'm also alternating which arrows I use together, so no line is the same as the next one. Now as I'm stamping this, I'm also making sure to keep my spacing really kind of not the same. And it looks more random, like a true pattern paper would. So once I have that finished, I'm also going to do my sentiment while I'm waiting on my masking fluid to dry. It does take a little bit of time to dry, and really I ran out of time here, so I let mine dry overnight, and that's probably your best option. So just keep that in mind, because if you do put water over that masking fluid while it's still wet, it's going to rip your paper once you go and try to pull that up. I did it myself because I'm an impatient person, and I learned my lesson, so just learn from my mistakes. So for my sentiment, I die cut a circle, and I'm just going to stamp "The Lord is with me like a mighty warrior." This is from that same stamp set that I'm using across this whole card. And there are still 4 more sentiments in that set that I could use, but I chose this one to use. And now I die cut this from regular cardstock, this circle, but I am going to add just a little bit of watercolor to this sketchy sentiment here. Now I am using a blue color, which is the same color as that pattern paper or that cardstock that I made into pattern paper on the background. And I'm also using some yellows, some browns for the arrow, and gray also for the arrow, and just as an added color. And I'll also bring in that gray when I do some coloring later on. Now I went ahead and I let this dry overnight. Like I said, I ran out of time, and now I'm going to go in and do this background. You can see that masking fluid has turned completely clear. There is no more white left. You can see straight through it, and that's how you know it's dry. So once I had that all dried out, and I went ahead and put just some a nice watercolor or a nice water wash over the back, just where I wanted the color to be. I'm not going to wet the entire paper because I do want the color to stop at a certain point. So I'm going to go ahead and use this Sakura Koi sketch box. This is the 36 color palette, I believe, and I am just using that blue color there to mix up a nice wash of color. I want it nice and intense, so I'm going back and adding color as I move along. And then once I get this completely covered with how much color I want, I'm going to go back in with some really intense color just right along where it would be the darkest shadows on this image. So you can see I'm doing that now. I'm being very quick about it. This doesn't take any time at all. But once I have that color on there, I'm not going to mess around with it too much more. It's really best just to kind of let it do its own thing and really just let it move on its own. If you try to control it too much, it will start to look like you've tried to control it too much, and it will look really forced. So just let it do its own thing. And then I'm going to go ahead and heat set this. I wanted to add some splatter over the back of this, and I was impatient enough as it was to let that masking fluid dry. So I did use my heat gun to dry this. If you want it to look even better, I would suggest letting it air dry. But I went ahead and just heat set this very quickly. And now I'm going to come back in with some dark yellow, some black, and also some very dark navy blue, almost a black color, and do some splatters. So I've put down a piece of scrap paper behind this before I started splattering, and then I just mixed up my colors very quickly on my palette. Now I'm just using that same brush that I used for the wash, dipping it in that color, make sure the brush is nice and saturated with color, and then I'll just kind of flick that brush right over that and add some nice splatters. So there you can see I did the yellow, I did the navy blue, and I did the black. You want to make sure that your wash is dry before you go in and add your splatters, or they will bleed into that wash of color and it won't be such a nice splattering effect. So I really wanted to intensify that black, so I just went back in with some straight color, and then I flicked some more little splatters right onto those feathers. So again, I heat set those splatters with my heat gun, and then I went ahead and removed that masking fluid. Now I used an adhesive remover eraser. These are only a couple bucks, and this just allows me to remove that masking fluid without dragging any of my color across the images that are behind it. So here you can see I'm just very carefully removing that masking fluid, and then once I had that removed, I went ahead and colored in my feathers with some very light gray colored pencils so they look white, but it just gives them a little bit more color and a little bit more depth. So once I had those colored in, I started to put my card together. So I'm going to go ahead and mount that blue cardstock that I created into pattern paper right onto an A2 top folding white card base. And I just use double-sided adhesive for that. Now for my watercolor panel, I'm actually going to pop this up with some fun foam and double-sided adhesive. Because I used so much water and I applied so much heat, I do have a little bit of warping. You can put that into a book and let it sit so it flattens out. I just use a little bit extra adhesive and it flattens itself out as I adhere it to my card base. So I just put my fun foam and adhesive onto the back of that panel, and then I'll just pop that right up over that blue panel that I had already adhered to the card base. The last thing that I needed to do was go ahead and put down my sentiment. And so I have a die cut circle here, and I just die cut this from fun foam. Now whenever you're die cutting fun foam, just run it through once and it will stick a little bit, but just go ahead and pop it on out and it will almost cut itself away. But I just use double-sided adhesive to adhere this right onto the back of that die cut. I'll remove the backing paper on the adhesive on the other side, and then I'll just pop this up right in the left-hand bottom corner of this panel. It does cover up those feathers a little bit, but I really like the added touch of this really scripty sentiment. But that will finish off today's card. I hope I gave you guys some tips on creating a watercolor wash on your cards. And as always, I will leave you with just a few finished pictures. For more information and the supply list, you can head to my blog as well as the Joy Clair Stamps blog. I will leave both links in the description box below. Thank you guys for watching today, and happy crafting!